Hello and welcome, everybody. I am Manuel Segade, the director of CA2M. Wait a second. Of CA2M Museum, Museo Centro de Arte 2 de Mayo, Móstoles, Spain. I am a member of the steering committee of this first edition of the European Assembly of Contemporary Art Centers, which is organized by the DCA, the French National Network for Contemporary Centers. This meeting will be conducted entirely in French and in English, so you can choose your audio channel in the bottom menu to access the simultaneous translation that is going on. You're welcome to ask your questions in the question and answer tab located in this the bottom bar, and please try to avoid asking them in the chat room. Questions can be written either in French or English throughout the session and directed to all speakers. They will be addressed orally by the chairwoman, Céline Cobb, during the Q&A session with the audience, scheduled from more or less 5 to 5:30 p.m. Due to the large number of participants, sorry, but we cannot answer questions by show of hands, okay? It is therefore with great pleasure for me to open this third meeting of this first European Assembly of Contemporary Art Centers. Since 2015, relationships have been developing across Europe between art institutions, sharing common values and issues. From this mutual recognition arose the desire to bring together people together by initiating a series of regular collective discussions open to all, the public and art professionals alike, on the major issues that affect our daily lives beyond the diversity of contexts experienced by our structures. Initially, this was designed as a two-day gathering in Paris in May 2020 on the issue of gender inequality within art institutions. And it was postponed due to the health crisis. But this inaugural edition is now being held online, as you see. This health crisis, while intensifying all forms of inequality and discrimination, has made it even more necessary, I think, to reflect on these issues within our artistic ecosystem. To this end, we have invited art professionals, artists, curators, critics, institution directors, intellectuals, and researchers to debate and share ideas and inspirations in a series of 4 online meetings, the third of which is currently underway. Multiple feminist approaches and practices in the cultural sphere have been and will be addressed along these sessions. When I say we, I am referring to the steering committee who designed this program, which is composed of Elfie Turpin, director of CRAC Alsace, Centre Renan d'Art Contemporain in Alcruch in France, Marianne Hultmann, artistic director of North Norwegian Art Center in Norway, Filipa Oliveira, artistic director of Casa da Cerca Art Center and the Almada Municipal Art Gallery in Portugal, Ursula Schlenderling, independent curator and longtime director of the Kunstverein Lachenhagen, and then the Kunstverein Heidelberg in Germany until 2021, and Antonio Cataldo, the artistic director of the Photo Galleriet in Oslo, Norway, and of course myself. I would like to thank all of them for the long-lasted involvement in this project, as well as the DCA team for the organization of these meetings, Marie Chenel, Chloé Moneron, and Eleni Pantelaras. The last meeting will be on June the 7th, and you can find all the information on the website, that is europeanassembly.org. This session, as the other ones, is recorded and will be posted on this website, and you can check the ones before if you had not the opportunity to be here. So I have the pleasure to tell you that this meeting is moderated by Céline Cobb. Céline is the director of Le Magasin, Centre National d'Art Contemporain in Grenoble, France. And from 2012 to 2022, she was director of Triangle, Astéride, a non-profit art institution and artist residency in Marseille, in France. In this capacity, she curated major projects with artists like Lise Magor, Lord Provost, the artist group ASCO, Charles Atlas, Jesse Darlin, Paul Maheki, Dominic White, amongst others. As an independent curator, she developed a long-term research and residency project in Memphis. And recently, she curated solo exhibitions with Andrea Budner, at Emrak Occitan, Sélignan in France, or Liv Ullmann at 68 Art Institute in Copenhagen, and the 2018 Rennes Biennale with Etienne Bernard. She's also a board member of the DCA who organized this program. So now it's my pleasure to give this room to her and to all the amazing women invited today. Welcome to all.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Well, hello, and thank you all very much for spending time with us this Tuesday afternoon. So today we will have two wonderful panels, the first of which, starting now, is titled Taking Care, Re-Evaluation of Practices and Ethics of Care. So I'm very honored to introduce our two first panelists, Elena Reckitt and Julie Pellegrin. Elena Reckitt has worked as a curator, education director, and editor for organizations including the ICA London, the Power Plant Toronto, the Contemporary in Atlanta, and Routledge London. As an independent curator, she has devised exhibitions, including Getting Rid of Ourselves, 2014, and Habits of Care, 2017. She's the editor of Art and Feminism, Phaidon Press, 2001, and Sanja Ivekovic, Unknown Heroine, Calvert 22, 2013. She's also the co-editor of Acting on AIDS, Serpentine 1998, and Instituting Feminism with Dorothy Richer on Curating 2021, and consultant editor of the Art and Feminism, Tate Publishing 2019. Currently, she's currently reader in curating in the art department at Goldsmiths University in London. And in 2015, she initiated the Feminist Duration Reading Group, which meets each month in London to explore underknown feminism. Julie Pellegrin is interested in the broad notion of performativity and practices that address social, political, and ethical issues, with an emphasis on notions of presence, relationships, and attention. From 2007 to 2020, she directed the contemporary art center La Ferme du Buisson in Noisiel in France, and currently she's resident at the Académie de France à Rome, Villa Médicis, where she's working on a book of interviews exploring the politics of performance in contemporary art, and also conducting research on the connections between artistic practices and anarchist theories. Julie was also vice president of the board of DCA for 2 years, from 2017 to 2019. So today, Elena and Julie, we've invited us to reevaluate practices and ethics of care, asking questions such as, how can we talk in a non-judgmental environment among peers felt like a constructive step towards unlearning unsustainable work habits? How can we imagine ourselves operating as part of a caring alliance? How can we push back against exploitative working conditions? How can we develop propositions for new habits and structures in which care would be more equitably valued, remunerated, and distributed? How can we care with others? How can we develop more reciprocal forms of care based in the redistribution of resources between curators and artists, institutions, communities, and publics? So Elena and Julie, we're listening to you.
Bonjour, merci Céline, merci Emmanuel pour cette introduction. Bonjour
Good
Elena.
afternoon, Elena. Thank you, Julie, for this introduction.
Alors, je vais commencer par
une
petite introduction,
by a brief introduction,
sachant qu'en préambule, je voulais juste dire que c'était un peu étrange comme situation de ne pas voir le public pour parler d'un sujet pareil.
About such an important topic.
Et j'espère qu'on aura l'occasion de pouvoir échanger physiquement très bientôt.
Very soon.
Donc, si la crise du Covid-19 a fait l'objet de discours virils et belliqueux de la part de beaucoup de nos dirigeants, Elle a surtout révélé une
leaders,
explosion
it
de la
has
crise du
revealed
care
an
que
explosion
nous
of this
connaissons depuis
crisis
des années
care that
dans le
we've
contexte de
experienced for years
violence
in the context of
néolibérale,
neoliberal violence and
patriarcale et
patriarchal
coloniale
and colonial
qui est le
violence
nôtre et qui
in our
affecte très
society, and this
directement notre
affects
secteur.
directly our sector,
Alors en
our
2010,
field.
en
in
2016, pardon,
16,
j'ai un problème de
sorry, I'm
son.
having a problem with the sound. Not me, her. She's having a problem with the sound. Yeah, I don't know what exactly is going on. Like technical issue.
Donc en 2016, on avait organisé avec DCA
In
des journées
2016,
professionnelles des centres
with
d'art
DCA, we had organized
qui réunissaient toutes nos équipes et
vocational
des
days and
intervenants
art
extérieurs.
centers with all our teams.
Et au terme de
and,
ces 3 jours, on a
external,
malheureusement fait le
guests.
constat d'une
After the 3
souffrance au
days,
travail
unfortunately,
croissante et
there
largement
was
partagée.
growing suffering at work, and everybody
Et à
was
ce moment-là, on
experiencing
n'utilisait
suffering at
pas
work.
encore
At
le
that
terme
moment,
de care
we wouldn't
et on
use
ne
the word
connaissait
care,
pas
and
encore très
nobody
bien
knew very
les
much
théories féministes
about the
afférentes
feminist
qui commençaient à
theories
être
that had to
introduites
do
en
with this,
France
and they
depuis
were
5-6
gradually
ans
introduced in France,
par
but
des
had been
chercheuses en sciences
introduced
sociales
over the last 5 to 6
comme
years
Sandra
by
Logier,
researchers and
Pascal
social
Molinier
scientists
et
like
Patricia
Sandra Logier,
Pepperman.
Pascal Molinier, and Patricia Pepperman.
Ces dernières ont choisi, comme on le
These
fait
women
aujourd'hui, de ne pas traduire le terme anglais
chose
dans le
not to
contexte
translate
français
the
pour ne
word
pas le
care into
dépolitiser.
French in order to make sure that it
Et je
remains
voulais
quite
revenir là-dessus en
political.
préambule
And I'd
pour
like to come
préciser
back
de
to
quoi nous
this
parlons
to
quand nous
really
parlons de
specify
care.
what we're talking about when we say
Contrairement à
care.
d'autres
Unlike
universitaires,
other
elles ont refusé d'utiliser les termes
university
français de
academics, they refuse
sollicitude,
to use the
de
words, the
bienveillance,
French
pour
word of
souligner
solicitude,
que
of
l'éthique du care n'est pas une
benevolence,
disposition
to
féminine,
clearly show that
naturelle
the
et
ethics of
essentialisante,
care is not necessarily
mais un
a
travail
female
d'attention
attribute
complexe
or
et
that is
exigeant.
natural and essential. It's a
Le
work
care
of
reste
complex
malgré tout
attention and
une
very
notion pleine
demanding care.
d'ambivalence,
Is a
parfois
very ambivalent
instrumentalisée,
notion.
parfois trop rapidement
Sometimes it's been
rejetée.
instrumentalized
Et
or
j'espère que nous allons
rejected,
pouvoir en
and
discuter aujourd'hui.
too rejected, really rejected.
En 2018, on a organisé d'autres journées
2018, we
professionnelles
organized
pour discuter
other
des relations
professional days
complexes entre
to talk
management
about the
et
complex
care.
relations between
Nous
management
avons
and
justement
care.
invité la
And we
psychologue
had
Pascal
invited
Molinier.
psychologist Pascal
Et
Molinier.
celle-ci nous avait un peu
And
bousculé
she
en nous
was
disant,
a
mais
bit,
vous ne faites pas
it
des
was a
métiers
bit
du care,
disrupting
vous
because she
faites
just said,
des
you're
métiers
not
de
doing
l'art.
any
Et
work
elle avait
of
tout de
care,
même
you're
ouvert des
doing
pistes en ce
artwork.
sens,
And she
en nous
paved the
disant
way
de
to
travailler
new
collectivement,
grounds
de nous
because she said
réunir
we could
plus
collectively
régulièrement, par
and we
exemple en
should
petits
gather
comités,
more
pour
regularly in
repenser nos manières de
small
travailler au
gatherings
regard
in
de ces
order to sort of
questions et
rethink our
imaginer des
work
propositions de
methods,
mise en œuvre
having these
concrètes
issues
dans
in
le
mind
cadre de
and
nos
come up with
activités.
concrete proposals to
C'est
implement
ce que nous
as
avons
part of
commencé
our
à faire, je
activities.
pense,
So
au
what
sein
we
de
started
DCA,
doing
avec la charte des
within
bonnes pratiques,
DCA,
les barèmes de
with the
rémunération
good
artistique et
practices
autres,
chart, the
jusqu'à
chart
cette
of good
assemblée d'ailleurs,
practices, and
et avec Elena et
a
Christine
sort
Shaw
of a
à la
scale
fin
of
du Buisson en
art
2019.
remunerations. And
Je dirigeais alors
with
ce centre
Elena
d'art
in
et j'avais
2018
invité
at the
Christine à
Buisson, I
organiser une
was managing this
exposition
art center
intitulée
and I had
Take
invited
Care
Christine
à la
Shaw
suite d'un
to
projet au long
organize an
cours qu'elle avait
exhibition called
mené à Blackwood
Take Care,
Gallery à
following a
Toronto.
long-term project she had led at the
Comme
Blackwood
un événement
Gallery in
sur ce sujet ne
Toronto.
pouvait pas se restreindre au
Of course,
format de
this topic
l'exposition pour Christine,
could not only be
elle avait
limited to
notamment
the
proposé d'organiser
exhibition
ce workshop
format
avec
for
Elena
Christine. She had
autour des
suggested
liens
we could
entre
organize a
curating and
workshop
care.
with Elena on curating and care.
Donc, je vais laisser Elena
So
maintenant
I'm going to
présenter ce
hand over
workshop
to
et peut-être
Helena. She's
revenir
going
sur
to
l'ensemble
introduce the
de son
workshop
travail
and
autour du
she will
care.
talk about her work
Je
on
voulais
the
déjà dire
notion
que
of
ce
care.
workshop avait ouvert
I'd
pour
like
moi
to
beaucoup
say
de
that
pistes de
this
réflexion
workshop
et
had
d'action
paved the way
durable,
to,
peut-être
new
davantage que
actions
de
and
lecture
sustainable
théorique,
actions,
qu'il avait
and
permis de
maybe
nouer des liens inédits avec des
more
personnes très
theoretical reading, and
différentes,
it had
y
enabled
compris
me
de ma
to
propre
create
équipe,
links with
et
very
de
different
comprendre que
people,
la plainte pouvait aller de
including
pair
my own
avec
team,
beaucoup
and
de
I
joie
understood
lorsqu'elle
that
fait
my
l'objet d'un
own
partage
complaint
et d'une réparation collective.
goes along with a feeling of joy, and
Merci Elena pour
it's
ça.
been
Et
widely
on se
shared, and it's
propose
about collective
à la fin
care,
de notre
collective
intervention
compensation.
justement de vous soumettre les propositions que nous
You
avions
may, at the end
forgées
of
avec
the introduction,
le
at the end of
groupe
the
qui avait
presentation, we'll
participé au
submit
workshop
all the
et d'en
proposals that we
discuter,
had developed with the group
avec
during the
vous donc à
workshop, and
travers
we'll
le chat
discuss
comme
them
le
with you.
disait Manuel.
Julie, est-ce que tu m'entends?
Julie, can you hear me?
Oui.
Yeah.
Il faut que tu te mettes sur le...
You have to speak
Excuse-moi, tu dois rester sur le canal
on the French channel.
Petit moment technique.
Slight technical issue of the sound.
Voilà.
I do hear you, but I am on the English channel. Is that right?
Quand tu parles en français, tu dois être
When you
sur le
speak
canal.
French, make sure you're on the French channel, otherwise they can hear the original, and they can hear the voice of the interpreter. They can hear them at once. So sorry for the slight technical interruption. Elena? Helena?
Yes, I'm here.
Je pense que c'est à vous.
Heard everything.
I basically heard Julie and the interpreter at the same time. So it was quite hard because you hear the two tracks, the two voice tracks in tandem.
So do you feel that you heard enough so that you can
I do, because I've read Julie's introduction. I hope the
Wonderful.
other English listeners are okay, but I think it is mainly French, or lots and lots of French speakers, so
Yes.
we are in the minority, and I think you could make it out, but it was a bit challenging. So is it now okay? I can just speak in a normal voice and it's being translated?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So
Thank you.
thank you for the introduction, Julie, and it's lovely to reconnect with you. We were meant to meet, of course, 2 years ago, but then this little illness occurred. So I'm going to share my screen, and let's hope that it works. Just give me a moment to get it on the correct viewing slideshow. So can I just check that slide is clear? Can you see my PowerPoint? Somebody give me
perfect.
Yeah, it's good. Okay, so I'm just going to make a few quite brief comments, but I will be talking a little bit about the workshop that Julie mentioned. This is my brief presentation. I'll start just by putting forward some very key definitions of care, which are by the political scientists Berenice Fisher and Joan Tronto, and which are quite a touchstone, which are quite often referred to. They weren't written about the cultural sector, but I think that these different aspects of care, which start with attentiveness, responsibility, competence, responsiveness, and then a later update by Tronto, plurality, communication, trust and respect, which he calls caring with, very much resonate within the cultural sector. And I suppose for me, my interest in the question of care and curatorial labour and cultural labour more broadly was that I felt that despite often talking about our work in terms of passion and love and vocation, we actually had created quite toxic work environments, possibly because of our over-identification with our work. So I'm talking about people like myself who've mainly worked in art centres, public art centres. And so it wasn't really to try to glorify or romanticize care, which I think is sometimes done, and I think to our detriment. It was really to take a hard look at who and what was being cared for in the cultural sector and the contemporary art sector, and who was not being cared for. And with this in mind, I often return to another more recent quote from a different feminist thinker, Maria Puig de la Casa, who points out the ambivalence of care. You know, care is necessary, but it can feel good, as she points out here, but it can feel awful. And so it's always important, I think, to be aware of the ambivalent nature of care. So a few things we can keep in mind is that care is needed, but undervalued and often invisibilized, that it often takes place behind the scenes, it's sort of background labor, that it's generally carried out by subjects who are feminized, classed, racialized, as well as having migrant backgrounds. As I mentioned just now, the danger is that it's naturalized as an inherent quality. You know, women are naturally more caring or maternal or what have you, and that it's seen as a labor of love and therefore doesn't need to be recognized or remunerated properly. And so there's always been a struggle around recognition and recompense. A lot of the invisible caring labor that takes place should really be covered by the state, and it is to lesser and greater extents in various contemporary societies. And it's also important to note that there's a time, that there's a temporal element, it's durational, it's ongoing, and it's often tedious, as the artist Meryl Lederman Ukeles wrote in her manifesto for maintenance art. Maintenance is a drag, it takes all the fucking time. So as you mentioned, 3 years ago, we were in Paris organizing this one-day workshop called Taking Back Care, together with the curator from Toronto, Christine Shaw. And there was a group of, I've got the list actually, the names, so we can see how many people. I'm going to say about 14, mainly people working in contemporary art contexts as well as education. And I think there were some people with a more activist background as well. And this was our schedule. So after some joint introductions and an intro from myself, we discussed the writing exercise. I'm actually now thinking what that writing exercise was because I don't have it here. But one of the, where we put quite a lot of our energy was to think through the idea of where refusal could become an important, act, particularly within our cultural sector, where cultural workers are often posited as sort of endless sources of work, care, and love, often to the detriment of themselves and also to the denial of the needs of those that they work with. So I gave the group an assignment to, I think they split into 2 groups, to discuss a situation in which they had said yes, but should or could have said no. And here are some notes that I shared with the group. I said it's not always easy to say no, and that it sometimes depends on having reached a certain level of material or psychological safety so you can tolerate what can feel like a sort of loss when you say no. And of course, we're not just talking about individual refusals, but saying no with others as part of a group or collective or movement, which enables that gesture to feel less isolating and potentially frightening. And that saying no in ways that are visible is really important, otherwise the gesture doesn't register. So how can we register absence as presence and resistance? And then I pointed out that refusing to accept the conditions of an invitation or a work appointment doesn't always mean walking away, but can mean showing up and behaving differently. So drawing attention to the politics and assumptions at play in order to then suggest how things might have taken place otherwise. So this is one of the role plays that perhaps Julie can remember what this particular instance was. I have forgotten now. And then after very much enjoying our dramatic moments, we collectively wrote some propositions for what we thought were important aspirations to work towards in the contemporary art field. And so I think the desire to create something more practical to hold on to grew from a frustration that I think Julie and Christine and myself felt with. It's quite easy and now quite ubiquitous perhaps to kind of diagnose the problems of the art world and those of the broader neoliberal society, but then trying not to become overwhelmed by the sense that we have no agency is quite challenging. So pledging to these propositions as a way of trying to feel that we can take action and are not completely powerless. So here are the names of the contributors, and I will now just take you through them. I won't bother to read them out because that will take too long, and we have quite a short session, and after this, Julie and I will go back and reflect a bit on the workshop and what it came out with. So here are our propositions, which have already been translated, as you can see. So the first one was a real focus on reciprocity, which the group felt building an environment of reciprocity could increase our collective capacity. Similar to that, we talked about the intelligence of the group, also thinking about ways of supporting collective processes rather than individualistic ones. The next one, that's what it's sort of reflecting a bit what I said earlier, that care is not inexhaustible, it is a finite resource, and also putting that in the context of the global south being exploited for its various resources, including those of care. The fourth, a little similar to what I was saying at the end of my previous statement, that it's not just about leaving or not showing up, but turning the conversation around to what's really needed. So using objection to point to and seek to make change. That is when you apply it, it multiplies. Number 6 was really about the importance of listening and respecting critical voices, and seeing and respecting those voices as a form of emotional labor, so not shutting them down, because often the people who are speaking out are the ones who've carried the burden of not being cared for. Number 7 was again about practical responses to the paucity of care. So Christine Shaw had given an example of securing funds to create positions in the gallery she runs in Toronto, and making sure that they were unionized so those jobs couldn't be rolled back if management priorities changed. And number 8 is somewhat similar to some earlier ones, which are around the collective process, reciprocity, and trying to break through the hierarchical structures that we've inherited. Excuse me. We then touched on invisible labor, ways to make that more acknowledged. Number 10, I think this was a reference to the sort of Donna Haraway, more than human. So also not just seeing care in terms of human care, but care for the wider environment, and recognizing the codependencies within that notion of care. And number 11, yes, this was quite specific. I think responding to the difficulty that the person who's pointing out problems in an institution are often scapegoated. So the importance of anonymous grievance structures. And the 12th one was again very specific, talking about payment and making a collective commitment to not accept work of underpayment. And I think that's where our propositions end. So I'll end my PowerPoint there. Are we okay? Are we happy to move on to the next bit of the session?
Yes, we are.
So I might just turn it to Julie because it was her invitation to me to be involved today. But 3 years ago, of course, we hadn't had a pandemic. We didn't have this war in Ukraine. Can you look back to the preoccupations that you had 3 years ago and the propositions that we developed together? And do you think we missed, what did we miss, or what has changed in that time from your perspective?
Je crois que si je reviens un peu sur le titre que nous avions donné au workshop et aussi le titre
You're still speaking
de
on the English channel. Sorry, Julie. Sorry, it's just, I can still hear both voices.
Is it better like this? Is this better like this now?
This is better for me. Yeah, I can hear the English voice.
Yeah, my voice.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing I'd come back to, in fact, is the title that we gave to the workshop and the title of the show, the Christian show, called Take Care. And the workshop's called Taking Back Care in that show. And the question I ask myself today is, well, when we talk about taking care, how can this become a form of injunction, a commitment to ourselves? We'd like to make this a rule that everybody adheres to. Sometimes we impose it. We'd like to impose it as women, certainly in the workplace. You know, it's something I'd like to come back to. It's a question I asked myself today. And a discussion today we're calling Taking Care. And so I wonder whether we could have actually used another title that sort of incorporated more the notion of the problem of this injunction that we give to others. And another question that we're talking about with the DCA 3 years ago, can the male directors of companies, can they impose this injunction in the same way? In fact, that would certainly be a question that I would raise now, a question that I would submit to the participants of the seminar today. And if anybody has got any experience regarding these injunctions that I'm talking about, these, then if they could share them, that would be certainly very, very interesting for all the participants, I'm sure. Well, I think that's it for the moment, I think.
I think it's I'm not exactly sure how to respond to the injunction question, because it's possible that the phrase in English doesn't, I'm not quite sure what it means, but I can certainly, and this is maybe not what I thought I was going to be talking about, but I've noticed a slightly strange situation in some organizations that I'm familiar with, where it's very, very difficult to prevent institutional harm, because for the most part, the people who are doing the harm are protected by the management and in fact hired by the board in sort of institutions I've worked in. And as long as the money's coming in and the audiences are arriving, the management and the board don't really get involved. The sort of places I work, the boards tend to be a lot of business people, wealthy people. They're not really involved in the organization. And one of the few ways that I've seen toxic managers be removed is through accusations of sexual harassment. And I actually feel quite ambivalent about this, because while I'm very glad that there is a climate in which sexual harassment can become the grounds for somebody being forced out of their job or gaining a reputation as a harasser, which means that they're not going to get hired anywhere else. It also saddens me that it's just this one form of abuse, because I think there are so many others. And I also think there's a very strange thing, and certainly in Anglo-American cultures that I'm more familiar with, which is at the moment being accused of being a sexual harasser is enough to lose someone their future. In fact, even if it's true or not. And that gets us into some quite tricky territory, because that can sound like an anti-feminist statement, and I certainly would hate that to be. But anyway, perhaps you can give some more examples, Julie, of what you mean by injunctions, because I'm not sure I've totally understood you.
Je pense que, par exemple, si je reviens sur le travail qu'on a fait au sein de l'association.
Coming back to the work that we've done in the DCA and similar associations, we went into working on the link between management and care. You know, collectively, we saw that there was a form of suffering. People experience this form of suffering in work, and it's people notice this in their in their work on a day-to-day basis, and people were talking about burnout, this extreme fatigue experienced by female directors. There was a particular these female women who exert roles, managerial roles. So should we be making requests at board level, or should we be making requests to offset this problem just individual level? But certainly care is certainly required with this sort of profile, that sort of person. And perhaps we need to acquire a new set of skills to be able to handle this sort of problem. You know, when when we're talking about care, we might be accused of saying, well, hang on, we're not actually doing care, we're doing something else. In fact, and you know, I come back to that to what our psychologist said. Hang on, you're not doing a care job, you're doing an art job. That's what our psychologist said. And so maybe so this curator's work we do, it shouldn't necessarily be a job, a care job. The word of curator already in its Latin etymology has the notion of care in it, of course, and some artists do require our organizations to take care of them, but the notion of taking care of the organization so that it survives, because some of our organizations, some of our centers are in a very fragile situation. There's the notion of taking care financially of the situation, taking care of the public, making sure that all the public has access to art, including the most underprivileged sections of society, for example. We call this the cultural and artistic education in France. It's becoming, and it's a very, very important theme now in France. So taking care of our teams with the skills that we don't necessarily inherit in our training or gain in our training, because we studied the history of art more than anything else, rather than how we take care in the wide sense of the term. And so clearly, you know, we're not trained per se to do this. So so that's really what I was meaning when I meant, injunction. The expectations would be perhaps the better word, I think, reflecting what Julie's saying. So maybe this could leave us to really examine the way we are, what our job is, and how we can act in a sort of in a many different settings, but many settings that require a very wide range of skills, a skill set. And certainly the public authorities should understand what the whole notion of taking care really does mean for us, and because it has many different meanings, understandings, and for it to be taken into consideration properly, it requires money, it requires means.
Thanks, Julie. That is much clearer. I'm actually quite impressed that you have workshops or whatever they are, seminars on managerial care in France, because I don't think I've heard anything like that in an arts organization in the UK. And for the most part, the real energy around care and the need to center it is much more coming from either people outside the organization, like artists, such as Johanna Hedver, the American artist who has published a disability rider that she presents to every organization that invites her, which lays out very clearly everything from what kind of room she needs, what kind of access the space has to have, how long she can perform for without breaks, to the fact that she needs image descriptions for every image that's associated with the publicity, and that they should always be referred to by gender neutral pronouns of they. What I've seen that is quite exciting is that these kind of pressures from outside sometimes then get adopted inside. So at the end of their disability rider, Hedver says, it would be so great if your organization didn't just do this for me, but adopted this in the future. And I have noticed that, for example, the Wellcome Collection in London, who worked with Hedver a couple of years ago, now does a lot of what Hedver stipulated. So, for example, image captioning and sign language interpretation is now part of their everyday practice. But for the most part, it's those who are at the bottom of the heap who are doing this work, and sometimes having their careers jeopardized because they get reputations for being, complainers, or the snowflakes, as the politically incorrect phrase for people who are socially aware and speak out here. I also think this thing of taking care of the organization is often used as justification for uncaring work practices, because it's almost as if arts workers are encouraged to internalize the threats, to then behave in ways that are self-sacrificial and detrimental to their and others' well-being. So it's almost like a kind of internalization of the neoliberal precarity then gets acted out, in a very Foucauldian way on an individual level. And that, yes, as I said, I think that usually often dominates a more collective understanding of care amongst the community of actors. So yes, I would just say that again, it is often the very lowest paid cultural workers who are doing the work. I've been very interested in essays that a young curator of colour called Jamila Prowse has been putting out, and she's arguing against a one-size-fits-all model of arts organisations that kind of force people to accept rigid time frames, very much geared towards public performance and spectacle and an exhausting program. And she's asking for something more flexible that is attentive, you know, to the particular needs of artists as well as workers. We're at the point when we're getting close to when we wanted to invite our audience, who I see there are lots of people here, but we obviously haven't been able to see them. But would you like to say anything else, Julie, before we open it up?
Yes, I can see that we have a first question that I'm asked to read in French, so that it can be translated and then discussed. Just to pick up with what you said, I guess what I was trying to emphasize, this idea of, you know, forcing people to do something. It's become like a justification, displaying things around the questions of care when an institution claims that it is an ethical organization that implements principles of care. So, unfortunately, when you think about management, the idea is only to boost the productivity of teams and improve performance. And the neoliberal approach, that's one of the problems that may arise. On the other hand, I have this feeling that over the last few years, the care notion has become a very sort of trendy concept in the world of art and the world of culture as well. And in general, I think that it's not really about the performance, as Sarah Ahmed clearly stated it when she talked about the communities of diversity that may start developing in universities, just to prove, on the one hand, that they are not racist, but above all, it allows not to do the work that should be done. And I think this is something that we had outlined during the workshop, that the care notion must go beyond a topic that has to be addressed within the organization. It should not be represented only, it should be implemented through very concrete and demanding work. And it's not always that easy to do. We have received a question from Céline Poulain. Oh, she in charge of the art center, the Contemporary Art Center of Bretigny in France. And together we had organized the professional days with Pascal Molinier. So I'm going to read out her question and I will translate. Okay. Thank you. I believe that the expectation that you've mentioned is ubiquitous today. It's become an additional burden on the same people, and without being given any means to achieve the goals, no decent salary, for instance. The input of Maggie Nelson in her work that was recently translated as On Freedom for Social Care and Constraint. It's very interesting when you look at the link connection between care and freedom and transformation of the notion of care, or when it's about when you're trying to sort of meet the expectations. Lena, would you like to say something? Helena, I'd like to say something. We've briefly talked about Maggie Nelson's interpretation. That could be, you know, like a hot potato. It's about the relationship between the notion of care and art.
You know what? I haven't actually read that book yet. I have read some very passionate reviews where, even though I absolutely love Maggie Nelson's Argonauts and Bluets, I'm not sure I'm in sympathy with her argument in this book, but I haven't read the book. I've just read that she's arguing for a kind of anti-censorship position, which I think is a bit too sweeping. And actually, I think it does deny the fact that I think we're in a different moment where the fragility, it's difficult for me to jump in on this because, as I said, I haven't read the book, but what I understand she's saying is that people who call for certain images to be restricted or certain artworks or books to be questioned are exerting censorship, whereas I think oftentimes the times, particularly around racialized imagery, where some communities of color have declared their anger at the uses of bodies of color and experiences of color, I think it's more complicated because I think it's often to do with broader histories of appropriation and exploitation. So it's a bit too simple to say that's just censorship. However, I shouldn't really get involved because I haven't read the book. Have you read it, Julie?
I just read the chapter on, pardon?
Sorry, yeah, I was speaking English. I'm sort of getting mixed up. Yeah, I'm back on the French channel. Yes, I've only read the chapter on art. Maybe I guess there was a misunderstanding because Maggie Nelson, she's been talking about the issues of censorship in art, and she says we do care about art. Art doesn't have to care about us, and I think that it's also a question that she chooses to address in a very refined and complex manner. But to me, art cannot take care of the people. And I'm thinking about the art centers and artists who work there, and I think this is a real question for them. Just to give you an example, on one of the last projects that we had, the latest project we wanted to organize at the Ferme du Buisson, and I refused to do the project because the artist didn't want to do it. And I'm very grateful for this. I'd like to thank him. And he drew my attention on certain work practices that were no longer questioned. It was Matisse Collins, and we were meant to do a project on the territory, the notion of territory, artist residence in a neighborhood, in a difficult area, neighborhood. We call them the neighborhood of the city policies. So the idea was that in those districts, after the wave of terrorism in 2015, the prefecture and the municipalities had multiplied the number of policemen on the streets to try to eradicate the risks of delinquents and Islam radicalism. But this was a real failure. So therefore, the local authorities decided to work with art centers and to replace policemen with artists. And obviously, the goal was the same: curb violence and delinquents and so on. So Maggie Nelson is not referring to this about what we're talking about, social-based practices. And in France, what we call art interventions in a given social sphere, but with a strong political agenda. And by this, I can really understand her statement and her claim when she says that art cannot take care of us. It's not up to artists and art to take care of us. But I do think that the notion of care sort of covers everything that allows art to happen and take place and be welcomed and received by the audience and understood by the audience. But she sort of leaves or topics of interest behind. The sort of question I was asking you, I mentioned Maya Black-Tessa, sorry for my pronunciation. So art can be something that has to do with care, because care is defined as something that holds us together. And so here we have the really function of art, which is the real care.
Okay, thank you, Julie. I know we were wanting to bring people in, but I'm not sure if we have time. Maybe we just need to hold on to the Q&A. What do you think? Well, this is another question, so shall we take this question, and then we can maybe move on to the next panel, I think, at that point.
Shall I take the...
You'll have to answer in about 3 minutes.
Exactly.
Alors, je lis la question.
So I will read out the question and I will translate. It's a question by Marion Guillemot. She works at the Contemporary Art in Occitanie region in France. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Just one slight comment, because I've been involved in many days of studies and conferences that deal with the notions of care, sharing, and cultural democratization, attention to the public, and attention to the art stakeholders and their diversity. I've noticed that when we have those discussions, we realize that precarious workers that you've mentioned, they really play a major role when to raise their theoretical voice or share their experience. Although most of the time in our structures and organizations, they play a great role in taking care of the public and bringing enough attention to the public and visitors. So don't you think we could learn things from them? Today, I guess they have things to teach us.
Yes. I think oftentimes there's a hierarchy in arts organizations, that those considered with the most authority are those that work the most closely with artists and revered works of art, and those who work closely with the public, not that there's one public, but different publics and visitors, are not consulted, and their wisdom is not sought out, whereas I totally agree. And I think that we need to have a much less hierarchical approach to knowledge, and especially when we're trying to be more inclusive and accessible, which I know is going to be up for grabs in the next panel. So I expect those notions to be thoroughly deconstructed, but even just to say, like, to be more welcoming and offer spaces of gathering in the way that Julie said art can do. Yes, those workers, those individuals and professionals should be taken much more closely into the core of the organization.
Je crois qu'on a... Merci beaucoup, Elena. Je suis vraiment désolée, j'ai du mal à passer d'un channel à l'autre. Merci beaucoup, Elena.
Well, thank you, Elena. I think we're drawing to the end of our discussion and the time given to us. So I'd like to thank Marion and Céline Poulin as well for their questions and remarks. I think it's a good point to finish on, in fact, and I think it gives us food for thought for the future, so that we can become more inclusive in this sort of panel.
Merci.
Well, thank you so much, Elena and Julie. Again, I'm inviting all of the audience to ask questions in the Q&A, because this is not finished, and I think lots of questions are about to be asked. So all the panelists will be joining us after 5 p.m. to discuss these questions. So please do ask and do make proposals based on what Elena and Julie just presented. So we just talked about the re-evaluation of practices of care and ethics of care. So we're now going to move towards the second part of this session with our two other panelists, Nane Burman and Iris Dressler. So the second part is titled Hospitality and Diversity Politics, the Ambivalence of Access. So I'm inviting them to join us. Here they are. Hi. So you both will be asking questions such as who hosts whom and to what ends? How can we be inclusive without reproducing given power structures? How can we create safer spaces without depoliticizing art institutions? How can we enable participations without paternalism? How can we avoid stabilizing given epistemologies by simply expanding canons and broadening audiences? How to deal with the risk of inclusion as a means of regulation and normalization? How do we avoid the moralizing self-purification of curatorial practices? And then how can we acknowledge the art world's our complicity with capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy? So to answer these questions, I'm really honored to introduce you to Iris Dressler and Nane Burman. So Iris will be speaking first. He's along Hans Kreis, the co-director of the Württembergische Kunstverein Stuttgart. And I almost got into German there. And teaches as an associate lecturer at the Staatliche Akademie der Bildenden Künste in Stuttgart. One of Dressler's and Kreis' main focus is to explore collaborative, transnational, and transdisciplinary forms of curating. They have presented solo exhibitions of artists such as Stan Douglas in collaboration with Staatsgalerie Stuttgart, Anna Oppermann, or Carrie Mae Weems. They further realized collaborative exhibition projects such as On Difference, 2005 and 2006, Subversive Praxis, 2009, or Actually, the Dead Are Not Dead, the Bergen Assembly 2019, Württembergische Kunstverein 2020-2022. The exhibition 50 Jahre, not 50 Jahre Bauhaus 1968 on the German Bauhaus reception in 68 was on view in 2018. Nane Burman is a researcher, lecturer, curator, author, and editor based in Leipzig and Kassel, Germany. Before her current job as a specialist for documenta and exhibition studies at Kassel University, she was a member of the Inter-Art Research Group at the Freie Universität Berlin and a visiting scholar at Goldsmiths University in London. She co-edited the On Curating issue, Documenta, Curating the History of the Present in 2017, the anthology situating global art temporalities, topologies, trajectories, 2018, and is founding editor of the research platform Documenta Studies, launched in October 2018. And now, Iris, the microphone is yours. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me for this very interesting discussion. And I'm always very impressed with people, if people can pronounce Württembergischer Kunstverein. You made this perfect. Yeah, maybe because you mentioned actually that Dead Are Not Dead. This was a project Hans and me curated with 10 other curators for the Bergen Assembly, but we continued this project in the last 2 years in Stuttgart, especially also because COVID came and then it got longer and longer. But it was basically dealing with questions of care and questions of political struggle in terms of vulnerability, how to embrace the death, how to, so there, but I'm not going to talk about this, but about hospitality. And I went back this morning to an old white French man, Jacques Derrida, who of course wrote this book on hospitality. But I think for these days, it's quite interesting because he's separating between all the agreements, the juridical, the social agreements, which are on hospitality if it comes to the stranger who still has a name and a social status, whereas the, as he said, the absolute other who has no name and no social status is not part of that system. And I think in these days, if we compare the European care and behavior and hospitality regarding Ukraine refugees and the experience on the other way, people from Africa or the Arabic countries make as refugees, especially also on the legal level, I think we have to discuss actually a lot. But just this for the beginning, I share the screen with you. So these are 3 photographs of a large series of the Afro-American artist Carrie Mae Weems, which she started in 2006. And of course, it shows what I think still is very much our reality. I mean, our art institutions are still not very accessible if it comes to the non-normative bodies, to specific regarding person of colors, etc. So I still think there is, even though we are talking a lot about diversity, this is still a huge problem, and that audience still, especially as the neoliberal museum is so much under pressure of commercial effects, that audience is still, even in terms of diversity, is very much related to that neoliberal and commercialized context. So I think we should be aware of that. Just a second. And then, of course, I mean, it's also about buildings, right, that she's dealing with. And of course, I mean, we have this problem of the postmodern museum, that you mostly never find the entrance. So you see here the Van Abbe Museum having a lot of problems, or trying to put a lot of energy to show the people where you even just can enter it. And of course, reaching out, I mean, if it comes to diversity, this has been talked about, and putting a lot of research on this, and it's interesting, but with this book it doesn't look very welcoming, but that's another thing. And then, I mean, we talked about this, but just and it's again the Van Abbe Museum, but it's just by accident. It's not that I have a special issue on this museum, but of course, I mean, we know that diversity is an important context, but it's also very close, of course, to the neoliberal ideas of reaching a diverse public. It's interesting that this is in Stuttgart, this is a Primark, and of course you have also these posters of diverse people that they are trying to address. And then there was a demonstration, and this has sustainability is the new sexy. So they are, of course, not at this moment talking about or discussing the way Primark start to address a diverse public, but that also the talk of sustainability is being used and abused in capitalist terms. And this has been just one of many discussions in Leipzig, diversity for sale. So yeah, there is a certain kind of mistrust. That's something I experienced as a director of an institution, and then a mistrust that I can understand if you're addressing diverse communities, be they people of colors, be they part of the CRIP movement or whatever. So there is, after all, I mean, by experiencing that at least many efforts regarding diversity are very often just focusing the surplus value of the institution and not really of the people who are addressed. So that has created, that's what I feel quite a mistrust. So what does that mean? How do we deal with this? But in general, if I think about the institution, I'm a director of an art institution. So what means hospitality, let's say in regard of two different guests, the invited guests. So I would say the artist, the audience, the staff, so my colleagues, collaborations partners. So all the guests we're aware of, we know that we invited them. So, and here, I mean, especially what I just take out 2 points that I'm interested in. The one is that, of course, again, came up very much through COVID, to see that the art system is very much and very deeply based on precarious work. I mean, still, and that. I mean, care, hospitality, we had it in the chart before, for me means a lot, responsibility. So I think what COVID again taught us, and it's not that we didn't know it before, is that we need really to take care for that issue. We tended all these years, or I tended all these years that I'm working in this field, to always say we would like to pay everybody fair, but sorry, we don't have the means. So, but now we must really come to that, especially, I mean, in those countries where institutions are still widely publicly funded, we must really care politically that we are getting into the positions to really pay fair fees, not only for artists, but for so many other freelance art workers, especially as we are also an institution which is not directly, that's maybe a bit different to the institutions in France, but we are not directly a municipal or a regional institutions. We are a private association getting public funding. So everybody we are working with are much less protected than if we would be a state-run institution. But anyway, for me, this is something now very important to understand, that we as institutions are really the ones responsible to care for that money that we can give to the people we are working with, our invited guests. And another thing, which, and it was already mentioned before, is the complex problem of self-censorship and censorship, because I think that is not only in the regarding accusations of racism, etc., an issue, but since we had ourselves experienced a big case of censorship, it was shocking for us to learn how much that is actually usual, that to avoid whatever kind of conflicts, very often institutions don't take the responsibility to take that conflict, but that they rather than take out the artwork or take out the speaker or whatever. So I think these are two things we in terms of hospitality and in terms of ethics, how we need to work with the invited guests, with the these are 2 points I think are very important. And also in all these very complex discussions of discrimination, I think still that, and the one thing is something an artist does, but the main thing for me here, I'm addressing this on the field of the art institutions, which is for me the platform that needs to take responsibility for this discussion. So there must be space for certain discussions and conflicts, and I think that's an important point to me. And then we have, and that is actually connected, and then we have the unexpected, the unwanted guests. And so, for example, the conflict, right? And at the moment, everybody is so much, I mean, on the level of institutions, everybody fears so much being accused of being racist, sexist, ableist, excluding, being hierarchical. So everybody just tries to position oneself at the opposite of this. But then we lose really also the space for going into the deep problems of these mechanisms. And so, yeah, I think we need to find ways how to not embrace conflicts, but how to how to embrace and how to give space, moderation for any sort of conflict. I think that unexpected, unwanted guests are related to the loss of control regarding collective processes, regarding modes of sharing, also regarding informal and uncurated formats. I think that sometimes we tend as institutions to over-curate things, and I think we should de-curate very many things. And I think the most, of course, complex and even frightening point on our institutions is and especially in the internal structures, is giving up and losing privileges. So, and what I want to talk about for the next moments before I give the floor to Nanne is one aspect that we are at our space quite interested in, or something we developed since 2012, is the idea of shared spaces. So these more uncontrolled spaces that can be used by different publics which are completely uncurated by us. But what are their problems? What kind of protocols would they need? How, if you make everything open, how you still can for certain moments also create safe spaces? And who is using these safe spaces or these shared spaces, and who is not? So this is again a question of trust. So I have, how much time I have still?
I think you're fine. You still have 5 minutes.
Okay.
It's up to you.
This is Hans, by the way. We are running the Kunstverein together. I mean, just to give you a certain idea. So the Württembergischer Kunstverein is really in the very, very, very center of the city. This is the central Schlossplatz. This is the shopping, the biggest shopping street in town. This is a parliament. This is a park. This is the opera house. In the midst of all this is the Kunstverein. So, and here's our entrance. So it somehow connects the consumer part with the leisure time. This space has become very important. And later on, also this part is where it goes. It's a public, it's an open air platform where here you have a park, just to remind you. So the entrance. So we started to use this, it's like the foyer, but you see everything is on roll, so we can also take out everything. And so that means that this space is used for different formats from our side, like this workshop, for example, but it can be also used from all sorts of activist, artistic, local groups. So it's a very simple structure. If somebody needs a space, because it's in the city center, so it's easy to meet there. But of course, if you want to meet in the city center, then very often you have to pay rent or to consume. So our interest was to make this space open and to share it whenever we don't need it or we don't use it. So that means this is a student project, for example. This is a project from local artists who use that space. This is a political group. This is about housing problems. So it is used by quite different audiences, and it's also we use it for our own work meetings. So it's really a shared space. It's used by us and by other people and groups. And of course, of course, it's because that means also that we are not always there. So now we also need to think about certain protocols, certain standards, so to avoid that there will be no racist attacks, for example, or sexist moments. So how this is very much the discussion how to create an open space, but make sure that people can feel safe there, whatever that means. But I think it's important. I maybe skip this. And so with COVID, of course, I mean there was this a whole problem of meeting, but also of spaces where you had enough space so that people could come together, at least at these moments where it was still allowed to meet. So we tried at that time to open up the whole building as much as possible. And something we did last summer was to create, I mean, this is this outside platform, which normally doesn't have a ceiling. So we built a ceiling there so that we could use it, because there was the only, at a certain moment last year, it was the only moment to gather. And it was after almost 2 years, it was so important that was 21, not 22, to have spaces again where you could meet. And again, there it's the same mixture that like inside. So it was used by us, by different groups for very diverse sort of activities. But the important thing was also that that you could that it was directly connected to the park, since during COVID.
I have a minute left.
Yeah, very, very short. During COVID, this space was basically used by young people, and in Stuttgart you have also living many people with migrant backgrounds, and you can, in this area, you can really see how racial profiling functions. And in one moment in the summer, when there was again a control of people of color, that situation escalated. And now it starts even more to be a controlled space. People get very criminalized. So now this sort of shared space becomes an important political place to really discuss the whole question who belongs or who owns that park, and who's and you see, even, and I finish with this was, for example, a conference by Migrantifa, which is a local group of people of color, and even their presentation directly brought the police to the platform. So there's something now we will basically try to work with different groups on this problem of racial profiling and the criminalization and control of that park. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Iris. Nane, the microphone is yours now. I don't know if you want to react on what Iris just said, or if you'd like to start straight away and maybe engage in a conversation later.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll do a dual kind of thing. But first of all, I wanted to thank you also for the invitation, and I also want to apologize for my voice, which is horrible because I'm sick, and it's a bit of a paradox that, you know, after this conference or the meeting had to be postponed for so a long time, now that it finally happens, I'm sort of ill. But I would like to try to make the best of it. And I think already like what all the speakers before me talked about was so interesting. So we could jump into the discussions right away. But maybe I will just talk to some points that I prepared on the PowerPoint, mainly because I was worried that at some point my voice might be gone. And let me share the screen. And I chose this image also because like also maybe listening to everyone before, it occurred to me like, while on the one hand it's really important also to acknowledge the precarious working conditions that especially as curators or caretakers we have, I always feel it's really important also to like check our privileges, as Iris has also already said, and to think about the conditions of possibility of our own work and the way this is again enabled and backed up by some sort of curatorial unconscious of racialized, gendered, and also classed labor. And I do feel that this is particularly important because in the art world or in the field of curation, I do have the feeling that most people, even though they work in precarious situations, often their family backgrounds is still quite privileged in a way, because somehow to enter the field, you maybe have to be able to afford to actually also work under such conditions. So this basically was an image that I just felt is a sort of reminder to really to take into account those invisible hands that are not part of the game or the field directly, but perhaps more indirectly as enabling infrastructures. I mean, yeah, I just put the slide on, as I said, because I was a bit worried that my voice might fail me, and it's an excerpt from an older text of mine, again, where I was a bit critical about a certain kind of identity politics and ideas of canon revisions that I feel are not enough because they often don't speak to the more structural conditions that are problematic. Basically, maybe to summarize my research of like the past 10 years or so, it started from heuristic homologies between exhibitions and households. And I'm interested in the political economy of curating and the social reproductive functions of curating as an emancipatory practice and as an instrument of power. And more specifically, I analyze how curatorial practices, discourses, and subjectivities have changed over time in relation to socio-economic and technological developments, with special attention to gender divisions of labor and power relations, but also the deployment of femininity and feminism, the biopoliticization of curation, its governmentality in neoliberal regimes of soft power, and most recently also, and I think this has been addressed repeatedly now, like some sort of commoditization of care, especially in the art field and the field of curation, but also the problematic implications of responsibilization of certain subjects, and also how that goes hand in hand with certain naturalizations or re-essentializations of certain subject positions. And I think some of these things have been mentioned before, and maybe much more eloquently than I could do this. And this is just like, yeah, some of the writings that I've done over the years, and perhaps hospitality was one issue amongst them, but I had the feeling that maybe like my work on hospitality is not directly relevant to the questions that were posed to us, like those questions of access, because it was more about reciprocal capitalizations in terms of hosting. So again, also more on the idea of how you can capitalize on certain practices of hosting one another. But then also, as I'm interested in this gender dimension of curation, of course, I also discussed a lot about the idea of this hostess, or the angel in the white cube, as I called it, like the idea of restrained femininity, and how this somehow informs certain professional scripts for curators, regardless of their gender. And maybe that's already enough to have an idea of this, like how I came to this, to this subject. So I took out this quote now from another text of mine, because this maybe spoke more to the questions that were like now meant to be addressed in the panel, about this idea of access and inclusivity. And again, I mean, just to make sure that nobody gets me wrong, I mean, I find these things incredibly important. It's just that I very often feel that they become, as people also already mentioned, like somehow idea, like part of neoliberal management, or they are recuperated. And so underground, and so then kind of really difficult to actually follow emancipatory agendas. So I got a bit lost with my quotes. Okay, I put this in just to also tell you that somehow the idea of hospitality and of hosting or of ghosting, because I do think there is a ontological dimension to it, and maybe that's also something that Iris, that you in your project about the undead, right, that are not dead, it's something that is important to you. And like I also, like the past 3 years basically have occupied me with regard to these questions from a very different angle, which brought me very deep into German art history, male, white, German, racist, fascist art history, actually. Like sort of the Germanic ghosts, or the fascist ghosts that I do believe still haunt art institutions, especially in Germany, very strongly on different levels, on economical levels, but also on epistemological levels, and that are often normalized, and so sometimes really hard to catch, or I think they are actually also sometimes embodied in our own practices and habitus. So again, I feel it's important to address our own complicities, maybe even if they are involuntary. So where is this bringing me now? I think it's quite important to acknowledge the way, like how somehow we are also part of the problem, and at some points, rather than externalizing the problems or historicizing them and pointing fingers to others, I think it's always a good idea to look at ourselves. So, I mean, I realized, like, if I went too quickly with the slides, because I forgot, as we talked about in the beginning, to read them out, you maybe have to scream and stop me to continue, or we can also go back to some of the slides later on if you feel like rereading them or discussing them. So
you still have 5 minutes.
Okay, so. And maybe then I should hurry on. I mean, there is this ambivalence of care, but this is also something that's been discussed already, so I just skip it. I mean, I just felt, because like 3 weeks ago, I visited the Venice Biennale, and I don't know who of you have seen it. I know Iris has, because we met there. So that's why I somehow thought maybe it would be interesting as also a starting point for discussion. And now I just try to really improvise very quickly over this, because I had a feeling, I mean, I guess you all know that one of the gestures of the main show was to have like a huge number of women artists primarily. So quite an important gesture in terms of feminist curation, but somehow I felt there were also a lot of problems with this choice and the way it was enacted. So, and I will just now very quickly talk to some of them. I mean, very superficially now also. I think one of them was that I saw a lot of breasts and butts and testicles and ovaries and egg shapes and all kinds of things. So I think there was like the idea of maternity and of a certain kind of body aesthetics was sort of problematic because it was bringing back, it was sort of, felt sort of re-essentializing and also reductive, like as if there weren't other problems to be discussed, especially after the past 3 years in which all kinds of things happened that somehow I didn't really feel were addressed very much implicitly or explicitly in the works showed. And so this is just, I just had some pictures because at some point I started in the main exhibition to just take pictures of these breasts, and I don't know how you call it, the breasts of a cow, but I mean, those were there also quite often, maybe to speak to the motto of Milk of Dreams. So sometimes this was quite obvious. So somehow this was something that bothered me, but maybe that's not my point here to make. I think what was also, of course, important was like that the Golden Lions went to 2 artists of color, and I skip this very quickly. I mean, what you see here now is the queue to like people queuing for the UK pavilion. So quite a long row and quite a long wait. And I do feel, again, don't get me wrong, I do feel that these things are really important. I just feel that they are not enough. Then I came across this pavilion, and actually I accidentally started to queue for it. But maybe you wonder for a second which pavilion it is, and then you realize that it's not a pavilion, but the toilets. I don't know, I mean, these are really bad pictures because they're snapshots, but maybe you can see that it's like the women lining on the one side, and then I just stood there for 30 seconds after I came out again, take those pictures, and like men were coming in pretty easily, and I was in the men's place. And I mean, this is ridiculous because I think all of us know these things and have experienced them so often, but I felt in the context of this show, after having been in the main pavilion with like these strong female presence and like all these strong arguments for it, I felt that this was a pretty good illustration of how on a structural level maybe there are things that have not yet been addressed. Also, of course, there's also still the binary logic that there is a men's and a woman's toilet, and this has not been changed yet. So also somehow problematic. And I'm also telling you this because it's not the first time that this happened to me. Here's some impressions of the 2019 Venice Biennale, where already there was quite a strong Black presence in the main pavilions. And where I had another experience also at the toilets. No, I think so where I also went to the toilets and had sort of unsettling experiences because I skipped the line, went into the men, but was then what felt quite violently held back from a hand behind. And when I turned around, I realized that it was the toilet lady. I don't know what is the official word for it in English, but the person in charge of the cleaning, of keeping the toilet clean. And she was a Black migrant worker, I suppose. And she was quite insistingly trying to police like this binary gender order. There was one of those conflicting situations where I realized again that you're like really in this very privileged art world situation, especially as last time I also had realized before that there were actually quite a lot of people of color working behind the scenes in the Giardini, and maybe I was sensitized to this because in the last Biennale I felt that there was much more stress on questions of infrastructural backup or support structures or prosthetic help, and also maybe because I had been to the German pavilion that was inhabited by Natasha Hadikigian, where she also sort of put the backstage on stage and addressed exactly those topics. So I'm not sure, I cannot reconstruct, but maybe these like artistic gestures then sensitized for this sort of problem. And kind of turning like also the attention sideways. So not here's the German foreign minister speaking, but the attention turning to the Rolling Stone of an anonymous laborer. So somehow I feel that there are some artistic positions that are very important to actually sensitize us to those structural problems. And I mean, this time we had again German Pavilion, a position that was addressing also questions of infrastructure or the curatorial or unconscious, and maybe kind of linking back to my current research on Nazi continuities, because it was basically an archaeology of the, again, fascist history of the pavilion. And one of the main, or for me, most interesting parts of this pavilion was actually not this archaeological work in the pavilion, but then the guided tours that they are providing to places of anti-fascist resistance in Venice. And I don't know if those of you who've been there have ever noticed this sculpture in the sea. I have to admit I hadn't for some reason. And only 2 days before I did the tour, I did see it and wondered what it was. And then in the tour, I learned that it was one of the memorials to the killed female anti-fascist partisan fighters in Venice. And so there were several other places of resistance or also of deportation and Nazi crimes in Venice, which I felt were, quite rewarding. So, but basically I'm at the end, and this was the creepy picture in my hotel, which made me at the end wonder whether this was not maybe also the partisan resistant. Okay, I'm there.
Thank you, you're perfectly on time.
Like I didn't try this, so I guess I just skipped enough things to make this possible.
Well, thank you, both of you. Do you, I mean, I guess I should invite everyone back in the room. And then, I mean, I don't know if, Iris, you want to react straight away as we start gathering questions. I also have some myself. So do you want to say a word, Iris, before I start with the questions?
Yeah, maybe just two points. The one is about because we definitely we met in the line for the French pavilion, by the way. And yeah, I share your doubts. And for me, another really problematic point was especially in Arsenale, where you go through halls and halls and halls, which were all dealing with the archaic, with the spiritual, and that was all coming from the global south. And then there was a cut and it said cyborg, and it was all the global north. And I think this is impossible in 22, right? I mean, so that was, so I had many doubts also there. And the second point I was just thankful for that ghostability. No, the ghost, the haunting. Because I think another thing we need to do in whatever our means, our institutions, is to deconstruct also our biggest successes. So what we did with this exhibition on the Bauhaus was because it was one of the most successful post-war exhibition of that school in this period, that we very critically took a look on it, how it didn't talk at all about all the entanglements, for example, with the heroes of the Bauhaus and the Nazis, which is known since the 90s, but no exhibition very often talks about it, and especially not in the year of jubilees. And we very consciously said, now this is, that's a moment really to talk about the problems of such big successes.
Yeah, and I think that just to respond, I mean, that is so important, because now doing this job in Kassel right now, I feel how difficult this seems to be for so many. And again, it's quite a surprise in the year 2022, right, or 2021, that somehow it seems to be so hard to look at those problematic histories, and maybe also really at the way we somehow involuntarily, because we inherit certain logics, and it's not so easy to get out of them, and that it seems to be such a problem to address them. And there I feel, and that's maybe what connects my two research areas also, like that there are again and again those urges of self-purification, of being on the morally correct side, and somehow not being able to see that it's much more messy or entangled, as you would say. Yeah.
Thanks. So we already have a question, but I'm not quite sure. So I'm going to read it. So this is Eva Debreceni, who's saying, thank you for your respective presentations. I'm participating as an artist and would like to have your views on the recent cooling off of the discussion at Documenta and the open letter that followed. So do you know which open letter she's referring to? Okay. So please then, for the conversation, if you could like address what the content is before your response. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's, I don't know whom it is supposed to, I have to say, because I'm a bit sick, I didn't follow up on the open letter, so maybe Iris, now you know more than I do.
Well, the discussion started in January, and it was the accusation that that Documenta would support anti-Semitic positions, which is in Germany very often when artists or thinkers are somehow being accused being too close to BDS, that there is even a law that says that institutions who invite people like Achille Mbembe, for example, they should not get public funding. So it's a very complex discussion in Germany. There was actually a plaidoyer for Weltoffenheit, which some months ago, which was signed by many big institutions, and which was doubting that certain notions of anti-Semitism related to that new law. And it was already then, regarding the public, it was the media, it was very clear that this is a very important but very tabuized discussion. So, but so in January it was beginning that the media was like saying, okay, Documenta has an anti-Semitic position, and they should clearly reject everything which has to can be close to that. Then Documenta says that they are going to make an event to discuss that on a broader level. In the meantime, there came an open letter from the Zentralrat der Juden, I don't know how you say this in English, which again was complaining that this panel would not be, or this event would not be diverse enough. And then finally, 1 day or 2 days before, Documenta rejected to do that conversation or that program at all, but to maybe reconnect to the discussion during Documenta. And then yesterday, I guess, came an open letter by Documenta where they, in a more elaborate, and I think it's a quite important letter, where they more elaborate on their position and why they decided not to do that program, and how they position themselves in this discussion. So,
and just now for me to understand, because it's, of course, and the open letter by Documenta 15 came through the press, the official press.
I actually it was published through eFlux.
Okay.
And then I saw that there was a German translation in Tagesspiegel, so maybe they also, I mean, yeah, but I think they
yeah, so I have to come here to learn about this now, which is a bit embarrassing, being in Kassel officially, but I mean, that's the part of being SIT. So I cannot say anything about the letter, but I'm really curious to read it, because of course also like the issues that as a research group now, I'm heading this research group with a colleague together on Nazi continuities at Documenta, and we also made a show in Fridericianum in the Kunstverein in December, which was about haunting infrastructures and the way we are all ghosts. And I guess it was also, it also was an attempt to speak to a lot of the problems that have been discussed in this and the panel also with Helena and Julie. One of the things that was again important to us was like how this is not finished and how those ghosts are still around. And I think the way these discussions are led right now, and of course they're very particular also to the German context, show us how much these ghosts are still around, but maybe also like I keep spending so much time now researching the 50s and what happened there, and also those moves of self-purification, or the ways I feel that right now a lot of protagonists actually try to defend like the historical Documenta or its makers in quite problematic ways, because again they feel it's maybe an aggression towards a certain what's it called in English, cherished idea of what Documenta was, or this mythos. So it was important to us to say that actually we still these things around. Okay, now I got my point back. Also with the war in Ukraine right now and the discourses like emerging around it, I feel that a lot of things are also coming back, like sort of in a strange undead way, certain logics. I mean, there are lots of backlashes on all levels, so this is really spooky. And then I also felt the first letter by Documenta, I thought it was quite peculiar how they, I think, used the idea of artistic freedom in a very like anachronistic way. It felt to me, it felt like it was the 50s idea of artistic autonomy and freedom, in a point where I felt that it could have, like the response could have been more intelligent or more up to date to what actually, like the practices that are actually currently there. So I'm very curious now to read the letter that was done yesterday, because I felt that it was maybe a hectic reaction, a premature response. But again, it's all really complex and really messy business. And I have to say,
this sort of comes back to what Iris was saying about mistrust, and I'm proposing maybe to broaden a little bit the subject, because you talked about how do we invite the unwanted guest, and then I think this could also like go back to Julie and Elena in terms of like how do we deal with these situations, because like we've talked about so many specific context and example, but like in general, so speaking practically, like What do you say about this? Whoever wants to speak first. Elena, I saw you.
Well, I just, because it's just, I think there are so many ways into it, but just from my own, I think the one that's closest to my life is the radical feminist anti-trans problem, because I'm so much of my sort of learning and love is for feminism, but how do we deal with the fact that a lot of the feminists that I love are anti-trans? I mean, they're not anti-trans, but they don't recognize trans women in feminist space, or they don't recognize trans women in women's space, and that is just deeply abhorrent to me. But I don't want to close the door on those other feminists. I don't want to only talk to the trans inclusive feminists or trans feminists, because then I lose so much of my heritage, what I love. But yeah, I also know that by taking that stance, I could be considered acting in a violent way towards trans women who feel victimized by what we call trans exclusionary radical feminists, TERFs. So I just want everyone to keep talking to each other, but I know that that's a bit of a kind of wishy-washy liberal position, or I want people to have a historical understanding about why some kinds of feminists might not want trans women in the room and feel threatened by that, where trans women find that gesture is extremely hurtful. So there's hurt on both sides. It doesn't make one side, the hurt reacts, the hurt produces horrible situations. It produces volatile situations that create more hurt. You can't magic it away, and that's obviously, we're seeing that in the anti-Semitic Palestinian chasm. We see it, there are so many other examples. We see it a lot between feminists of color and white feminists at the moment as well. But you can't wish those conflicts away. So I don't know, that's probably just not very helpful. That's just where I'm at with trying to figure it out.
What about you, Manuel? Because in your program, you're addressing these topics very much. So, I mean, are you going towards like the conflict, or at what point is, like inviting the conflict something that, could also being being complicit in a sort of like attention grabbing type of, regime of attention? Okay, I think Iris wants to answer your question. So Iris.
No, it's maybe not inviting the conflict, but and there I'm close to the question of censorship, self-censorship. It's not avoiding the conflict. It's not like saying there is no conflict. We need to do everything to have no conflicts. That I see as a really, really huge problem. And maybe regarding building mistrust, I think that's not only inviting, but also visiting. I mean, I think that, and it's a long process to build trust, and to thinking also about maybe unusual formats. So what came for example now with the exhibition of Carol May Weems, which is it's a very emotional exhibition dealing with, among many other things, with racial violence, etc. So there's a need now that that was formulated, that people of color want to make tours, but only for people of color. And I can understand that very well. And I think sometimes we must give up also a little bit our spaces of privilege and say, okay, take it, it's yours, just do. These are maybe step-by-step little really not very spectacular, very little gestures or ways of dealing with each other. That let's see what they mean.
So there is a comment or a reaction from Eva Drobaceni. Like Mark talked about this last time, the safe shared spaces that Iris mentioned are essential to open up such discussions. If independent from institution, they might avoid being censored. Thank you for your reactions. Elena, do you want to react?
I don't think that's true. I think we see just as much volatility, hurt, outrage in independent spaces or autonomous spaces. I don't think they're somehow more conducive to accepting difference or holding the difficulty of deep conflict. I just think in some ways possibly less, because the passions involved in people who are working in autonomous ways and perhaps doing, you know, organizing spaces or projects through their own political convictions and so on, they're much more passionate and deeply held than people who are perhaps just doing a job and can say, we bring everyone together, everybody has a place. No, if you're running a, you know, a feminist space or a Black space, you're like really putting yourself on the line.
I should precise that the person we were referring to was Mart Van Fortune from the previous session. So do you want to ask questions to each other? Or I don't know. I mean, I was like, maybe there was one question that you asked earlier, which was, you know, a situation in which, like, we recently said yes and should have said no. I mean, certainly, I think like all of us in the audience included, like probably thought about the last thing that happened maybe, you know, yesterday or like last week. So I don't know, maybe if we actually ourselves answer that question, this will invite more reaction from the audience. Julie, what about you?
Si je dois donner un exemple récent,
if I should give an example, yeah, if I had to give an example,
un petit peu délicat.
Well, it's a bit of a touchy experience. I'll try to talk about it without questioning the context or the institutions I'm referring to. Quite recently, well, at the moment, I'm a resident at the Villa Médicis, and in the main area of the villa, which is a public space, public area that's open to the public. It's the only place that is open to the public, and it's supposed to host activities and events. And our work as resident is to, you know, use the space where we can only show tapestries or series of tapestries which represent scenes of slavery, images of slavery. So that was quite a bit of a surprise when we arrived here. First time we actually refused to work and show our work in this area, but eventually we accepted and our request to move those tapestries was actually unheard, and they didn't move them out. And we, despite this, we kept working for the institution. And I think that I would have liked to refuse, because I think it would have been a very productive sort of refusal, as Helena said, because it's a capacity to act, and in this specific work context, I was not comfortable with.
Makes sense.
We sit down.
Well, it's 37 minutes past 5, so there's no other questions coming up. We could continue talking a little bit. There's so many interesting things that were said, this would probably call for many other conversations, but what do we do from now? You know, where do we leave the audience with this? Like, can we just do a quick roundtable that's like a couple of ideas or words that kind of like hit you, or that you kind of stayed with, or your thoughts are still kind of anchor, that could be next topics or things to keep thinking or acting about? So who wants to start? This is a difficult one, huh? I've wrote many keywords personally, so maybe I can start. Of course, I really loved rehearing Mariola Domeniuki's quotes that says how much maintenance takes all the fucking time. So definitively, you know, that stays with me on a daily basis. Caring for the survival of institution, like you said, Julie. I was kind of really struck with this moment of maybe also due to language and misunderstanding between what's being requested and the word injunction, which as a French professional in the French context, I understand very much. And the fact that you, Helena, was saying that, you know, how did you put it? No, you said that, Julie, that's like, it's always difficult to prevent institutional harm. And then we talked about management. And I think maybe at some point this needs to be addressed like in a further conversation by itself, because the mechanism are not so binary between, you know, also like management and the board. And then you know, sometimes also like a direction can be harmed by the board. So it's not all one way. And I think maybe that's probably what Julie was somehow being referred to in terms of injunction and pressures from public funders. I mean, I want to finish on something beautiful, but I have many words. Yeah, okay. So Nane, you at some point asked the question of background and access to work. I think, you know, this is maybe like where I personally would finish, like education is everything. If we want to act for change, that's where the future lies, where, you know, we have to like be involved in training future generations that are gonna be, you know, curators and workers, a diverse one, caring for institutions and for everyone to, you know, kind of create a different art world. So that's my thing. And what do you leave the audience with then? Okay.
Well, I would also say training, I think, to kind of respond to what you just said and what Nana said earlier, which is to kind of somewhat displace ourselves. So we're not just replicating people in our own image with our own educational or class backgrounds. And I can't speak for everybody here, but, you know, I think I agree with Nana that for the most part, this is quite a sort of middle or upper class profession, even though we become poor by doing it. But and to actually really challenge ourselves to look at what people are bringing that may not reflect what we think a kind of good academic background is, or, you know, what have they done as activists? What have they done in their communities? What have they done? What kind of creativity have they made that might not look like art, but also shows incredible, you know, skills and verve, but that doesn't fit a sort of European middle or upper middle class model.
Does anyone want to add something?
Maybe basically like 3 points. The one, I mean, talking from an institutional position is to take responsibility, to overcome the fear, especially regarding uncertainty, because maybe it's about embracing also uncertainty, especially of our concepts and structures. And the third I just forgot, but maybe the 2 ones are already. Yeah, and then dealing with the ghosts, I think is another quite. So these 3 things are, I think, quite something for to do.
Right. Well, if no one else wants to say anything, then I'll have to finish with the word thank you. Thank you to all of you. Thank you to everyone who took the time to listen, to ask questions. Thank you for all of the team of TCA, for all of the huge work that they've put for so many years in the steering committee, you know, dragging, this is a drag, like all of this, you know, questions and just getting all of us together. That was really great. So thank you. And all right, so I should remind everyone this is not over, like we're continuing this process. So the next session will be June 7th from 3:30 to 8, and you need to register on the website, europeanassembly.org. The conversation will be longer than this one, because this will be concluding this whole process. So be there if you can, that would be really great. And the conversation will be moderated by art critic, philosopher, and curator Géraldine Gourde, together with Philippa Oliveira from the steering committee. I mean, you have all of the program, which has been so truly put together, and there will be, again, wonderful speakers involved. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you soon.